Hello, this small and hopefully informative talk would be about biopsychology. It's an area of psychology that's emerging of considering brain functioning as well as behavior. There's other areas that have a combined interest in brain functioning and cognition, among other things, or brain functioning and emotion. There's just a whole range of these kinds of um, subfields, if you will, that just merge two different factors into a more coherent whole. So, kind of like, how does the brain give rise to behavior or who we are as people, if you want to go that far? So, the general importance of biopsychology is that it studies the basis of behavior and things such as neurotransmission and, the general functioning of neurons and how that can affect, moderate, amplify, um, sort of, you know, excite or inhibit certain neural activity that can lead to certain behavioral outcomes, among other things. But the ultimate goal is to really bridge psychology with neuroscience, which is a growing effort. Um, it really helps to kind of validate psychological or psychiatric research to be able to bind it to the brain. It's a very helpful thing to do, and psychology's been leveraging more and more neuroscience related knowledge year after year. So, in general, it's sort of physiological and psychological altogether. So, the overall focus here, or agenda rather, is to discuss brain and behavior, brain lobes and basic function, neuron basics like anatomy and action potentials, the brain computer analogy, and my camera icon's in the way here. I might have to move that after. And merging psychology and neuroscience is what that is saying. So just a little overview, and all these are points that are briefly going to be touched on. As a disclaimer, I have a psychology degree and I'm working towards a data science master's degree, but I don't have a professional opinion on these things. I'm just trying to bridge what I know with things that are currently known. So the brain behavior connection is centered around a really big question, in that how does the brain moderate behavior? And in thinking of behavior, we generally think about observable patterns of movement. So movement is the primary evolved function of the nervous system. It is easy to think that the brain or a nervous system are primarily related to things like cognition and behavior. But first and foremost, in the most basic sense, the nervous system revolves around movement. So, and the earliest evolved nervous systems are, like nerve nets, that function as sort of a nervous system in a very rudimentary way, but not so as to facilitate complex movement or even really complex behavior or cognition. So neural circuits moderate basic actions, more or less. Interneurons connect and moderate the actions of incoming and outgoing signals. So in that sense, afferent, which is incoming signals, and efferent and outgoing signals, they're moderated by interneurons, among other things. Excitatory and inhibitory action, which of course can relate to things like the chemical concentration at a synapse, or what kind of signals propagating along an axon body, excitatory or inhibitory. All of that is kind of bound up in the same chain of events in a way, from the interneurons, efferent signaling. It's all a part of sort of a circuit, if you will. So incoming signals move from the periphery to the central nervous system. So like stepping on a thumbtack, which I haven't done. I've stepped on toys and plugs, but it's all painful either way. You step on something, the afferent signal goes from the periphery to the central nervous system, and then the sort of response to that would be the reflexive action of moving your foot away from whatever caused the pain. And outgoing signals move from the central nervous system to the periphery, which again would kind of be that response, reflexive response, or even, movement that is sort of voluntary. Anything that's going from the CNS to the periphery is going to kind of be considered outgoing or efferent. So the functional regions of the neocortex. The neocortex is the most recently evolved part of our brain. It's what generally gives us our higher cognitive functioning and what makes us experience sort of a quote-unquote human experience, if you will. It's a rather generally thin outer sort of covering of neural tissue that is 6 layers deep, 6 layers of neurons deep, that all interconnect in varying and complex ways to facilitate different kinds of things. And there are, cortical and subcortical interactions that can facilitate complex action, some of which would relate to, functional areas, specialized cortex areas for specific functions that are local to specific lobes of the brain. So the frontal lobe is generally reasoning, planning, executive control, higher cognition, being able to plan for future events, being able to ensure that, you are able to exercise some degree of executive control and that your attentional resources are going to where they need to be so that you're not easily distracted. There are sort of things that can lead to a dysregulation of that kind of executive control and can make paying attention or planning a lot harder. The temporal lobe is generally interpretations of sounds and language. And there are there's other aspects of the brain like the occipital lobe, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that can project onto other areas of the brain. So just because a certain area of the brain is discretely defined as a certain lobe doesn't mean it's not interacting with other parts of the brain. So there's sort of a projection in a sense that, there's this cross-brain communication. And the visual stream definitely crosses more than just the occipital lobe. So the parietal lobe is sensory processing, touch, pain, somatosensation, nociception like heat, cold, and whatnot. So anything relating to a sort of touch or tactile sensation is going to kind of correspond to that area. I'll say more about that very briefly. There's a whole little segment dedicated to that because there's quite some interesting factors going on there. And the occipital lobe is, the visual stream, and it projects to other areas like the ventral and dorsal visual stream. So for example, the ventral visual stream would project from the occipital lobe to the temporal lobe, and that would encompass sort of identifying what an object actually is. And if you were to sustain damage to that area, you could have a kind of visual form agnosia, which means you can identify a certain range of objects. If the damage is localized to the fusiform face area, which is the area that is evolved to a specialized recognition of human faces, then you would, probably experience prosopagnosia, which is a partial to complete inability to recognize human faces. So cortical and subcortical areas work together in facilitating and moderating behavior and action. The cerebellum is important to consider. Intentional voluntary movement and procedural movement learning, like sort of aiding in muscle memory, knowing how to do a complex task, ensuring that tasks are able to be done in a way that, is successful, like grabbing an object, using an object, riding a bike, anything relating to muscle memory and intentional voluntary movement at its base is kind of facilitated through the cerebellum. It's a very complex thing. And visually, it kind of looks like a miniature brain in a way. But, it contains roughly 60 to 70 billion um, neurons. It's more than the neocortex, but it's, I believe, approximately 86 billion neurons between both. So a lot of complex action being facilitated between both the neocortex and cerebellum. So if you have damage to the cerebellum, that might lead to an issue with balance or the control of movements. So I think damage to that area would be really apparent if you were experiencing it. Pardon me. So this is kind of an extension of the parietal lobe, the sensory cortex, somatosensory, sensory motor. The sensory homunculus, which if you've taken any kind of general psychology, you probably have encountered it. It relates to the band of neural tissue, which again are these sort of somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex. It's a band of neural tissue within the parietal lobe that has an inverted map of the body, a body map relating to the sensation of different body parts. Different amounts of neural tissue, neural representation for each given body part. So parts that are more used get more neural representation. So like this, I'll get to this strange image in the bottom in a second, but hands are highly used, highly sensitive. So there's more neural representation in the brain for hands, for example, like lips, hands, and other such things. Phantom limb, which a lot of people have heard about, I'd imagine, relates to sensory processing despite a missing limb or hand or foot. So if you were to lose an arm or a leg, I'm not sure how. I mean, there's many ways I suppose one could lose an arm or a leg. Maybe they were injured badly or there's a disease that required an amputation. But the idea is that you can still feel that limb being there, even if it's physically not. That's because that neural mapping and that innervation of the tissue that relates to that sensation is still largely present. So there can still be a firing that leads to the sensation of that limb being there because that cortical mapping is still present. There's some ongoing theories that this cortical mapping is established earlier than is once to be believed, as evident by individuals who are maybe born with either without limbs or severely damaged limbs that either require some kind of amputation or some kind of surgical intervention, that they can still have that phantom limb sensation very early on, so that this body mapping phenomenon seems to maybe occur in stages that are either earlier than believed or more advanced than believed. There's some things to be said about that. So it's helpful to notice the disproportionate design of this image at the bottom with the homunculus. It's to correspond to the neural tissue that represents how sensitive or how used these parts of the body are. So it looks a little bit unusual, and it is. This image has had some negative feedback in terms of just how strange it looks, and maybe there are better ways to depict this phenomenon, but it works for what it's worth. And again, you can see at the top right what parts of this cortex correspond to which parts of the body. So yes, it's just a band of neural tissue, a strip that corresponds to these things. Now, the general neuron structure is that, it has a nucleus as all cells do, but a particularly defining characteristic of a neuron are the axon terminals and the dendrites. They're very characteristic, the most visually apparent thing about them, really. And so this kind of branching dendritic structure, the development of that in response to things like neurogenesis and all things bound to that, is called arborization. So it's kind of the tree branch-like growths that are, characteristic of dendrites. The myelin sheaths are coated in, well, the axon body is coated in myelin sheaths, and they help to propagate, the signal along the axon body to make it more efficient and to ensure that, neuron communication is, efficient and expedient. And axon terminals and axon terminal buttons and whatnot are where the synaptic and neurotransmission occur on a chemical level. The synaptic cleft is where these neurotransmitters that are bound inside of synaptic vesicles, exit into the space and bind to a receptor site, or there can be reuptake. There's different modes and mechanisms to this process. It's quite complicated, but the idea is that certain neurotransmitters correspond to certain kinds of behavioral, cognitive effects, or even can impact muscles. Like acetylcholine is really important with muscle contraction. So if there was some issue with, a receptor binding site for acetylcholine, maybe your muscles couldn't contract properly. Could lead to paralysis if it was some kind of severe damage to that kind of process. So each neuron is estimated to have potentially thousands to many thousands of connections to other neurons. This unsurprisingly results in many trillions of overall synaptic connections in the brain. So if you want to understand this biopsychological framework, a lot of it relates to just all of these neural connections and just how significantly complex it all is. So these things can project to different areas of the brain, of course. Neural processes are both localized and distributed. It's kind of a key concept in neuroscience, really. But neuron communication, it's electrical along the axon body and chemical at the synaptic cleft. So this action is facilitated through excitatory or inhibitory action. And I'll get into a bit more of how neighboring neurons might be affected by that kind of action potential and what that implies. And of course, my camera's in the way of the last one again. I'll try to move this. I don't think it's possible to, unfortunately. But the vesicles contain neurotransmitters. They bind to a receptor site for use or reuptake, etc. And things like SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors would relate to the amount of, say, serotonin present. So things like agonists or antagonists can relate to the amount of neurotransmitter that is available for use. So an agonist would essentially magnify the presence of a neurotransmitter within the brain to be used. So if something inhibits the reuptake of something, it's an agonist because it's promoting a greater prevalence of that neurotransmitter. An antagonist is essentially something that diminishes the presence of something. It tries to inhibit the presence or usage of a given transmitter or what have you. So that these things can have a dramatic impact on mood and cognition. Too much dopamine, not enough dopamine, things along those lines. So action potentials, they seem a bit complex at a glance. They're not necessarily simple, but a basic concept is generally that the resting potential of an action potential is negative 70 millivolts. That's essentially the resting potential, kind of the neutral state of this kind of neural communication. But excitation or inhibition is really based on the chemical influx or efflux of, a variety of different chemicals and other such things. So think about potassium, calcium, they play a role in this. So the relative concentrations of a particular chemical would facilitate excitatory or inhibitory responses. So if you look to the left, you can see a depolarizing graded potential and a hyperpolarizing graded potential. Um, Essentially, if you consider action potentials, you will notice that there's kind of a characteristic appearance to them. The usual kind of, I guess, spike, if you will, has this sort of crossing of the threshold right here. So a larger stimulus that depolarizes above the threshold might trigger an action potential in a postsynaptic neuron. So as I mentioned prior, action potentials can affect neighboring neurons, and a signal can propagate many different neurons and be inhibited at a certain point. So, but again, action potentials are all or nothing events. So either it's going to happen or it doesn't. There's no such thing as like a have potential. It is either going to be excited and propagate along the axon body, or be inhibited and just not. There's no in between, really. But a larger stimulus causes more depolarization, and what can create hyperpolarization depends on the specific ion channels activated in the cell membrane. So ion channels can essentially open and allow for the influx or outflow of various, of various chemicals. And it's a pretty delicate process. And like the potassium pump, it is kind of responsible for the large caloric demands of the brain to maintain these chemical pumps, to kind of help act as a threshold between the inflow and outflow of these things. So there's a lot more that can be said about action potentials, but I'm just trying to condense it into something really straightforward. So thinking about how neurons communicate with each other can lead to this whole brain-computer analogy. Brain and computing. It's a broad area of interest that is rooted in cognitive science, computational neuroscience, a lot of things really. So neural learning, there's a lot of applications for it, from information encoding to understanding memory to computational technology like machine learning. Now, machine learning is predicated upon understanding how neurons communicate with each other. So things like deep neural networks, machine learning, it shows how understanding the brain and its functioning and how human beings learn and remember can transfer into a lot of different contexts. So it's not really necessarily straightforward. So a cognitive scientist, for example, might have an interest in understanding intelligence processes in the brain and how an intelligence process might look computationally in terms of AI. So it's an area of interest, certainly. But synaptic connectivity in the sense of brain functioning, I consider to be two primary factors. It's very reductionist, and I mentioned this before that these two terms can describe a lot of things. LTP, long-term potentiation, and LTD, long-term depression. So these kind of respectively strengthen or weaken synaptic connectivity over time. So it can give you a lot of insight as to what sequence of neurons are in sort of a regular state of communication, so to speak, and which are not. So, synaptic strengthening indicates perhaps, that there's a more regular propagation of communication between a certain, range of neurons. And if something is unused in the sense of neural communication, it's generally pruned out in that sense. So something might be weakened over time in terms of neural connectivity, but what contributes to synaptic strengthening or weakening, there's quite a lot that can. So it is a bit reductionist, yes, but just think in broad terms. What makes the connections between neurons stronger and weaker? And what can you leverage from that kind of knowledge? So encoding generally involves converting information into storage. And if you want to understand memory in a more physical sense, you'd consider, what memory processes occur within the brain itself, yes. But an engram trace is the physical neural pathway of encoded information, more or less. So learning and memory as a consequence of this, or of knowing this really, isn't localized to just one discrete area of the brain, but can involve more areas. So it's not as though memory is just bound to one little slice of the brain. Different components of memory can be processed by different areas of the brain. Like many things, it's a complicated process. Hence why biopsychology is so helpful in helping one to understand how this complexity kind of harmonizes and produces, you know, maybe data or brain data or EEGs or fMRI imagery that is kind of congruent with what's known, merging brain activity with some of these concepts in behavior and psychology. So brain plasticity or neuroplasticity is more or less the kind of adaptive and compensatory ability of the brain. It's more pronounced at an earlier stage of brain development than it is in later stages, but it does persist throughout the lifetime. So if you were to say sustain an injury, a traumatic brain injury, when you're 7, you would likely recover from that more completely than if you sustain the same injury at the age of 50, right? Your brain never loses the ability to adapt, but, how quickly it's able to adapt is contingent on many factors, and age is certainly one of them. So, there's a lot of implications with this regarding memory and learning, such as LTP and LDT, which I mentioned in the previous slide. So consider what's pruned out versus what is retained. How do synaptic connections get stronger or weaker? Many things can be inferred from this dynamic. So again, understanding how the brain works and learns and remembers can be used in other contexts, such as within education, law, forensic psychology, in a computational sense. With respect to education, something like how the brain learns information or encodes information more effectively can translate into better study strategies and whatnot. So this little diagram looks a little complicated, but it kind of depicts machine learning. It's kind of an iconic image in depicting things like neural networks and machine learning. So machine learning / AI has connections to thinking about the brain. Some information can be processed or rejected based on certain input, what might affect neighboring neurons. So that's kind of what this little term here, lateral inhibition, corresponds to. Not only how given input is interpreted or processed by neurons, but how it affects neighboring neurons. So you can think of kind of this weighted connection between neurons and maybe what's more likely to trigger excitatory versus inhibitory responses and how those responses affect neighboring neurons. And you can kind of have that chain onto many different neurons, neural networks and deep learning networks. The reason why they're kind of difficult to capture is because, again, our brain has trillions of these connections. So computationally replicating them involves many data points. It's not exactly easy to just parse all of that out. So it's a process in developing these kinds of algorithms that you might see in regular use today. So I'll reference the idea of a Turing machine, which is kind of foundational to computing, and cognitive science certainly has an interest in these kinds of foundational concepts too. That Turing machines, first described by Alan Turing, are simple, abstract computational devices intended to help investigate the extent and limitations of what can be computed. So again, we're kind of brought to think about how the brain, quote unquote, computes and how we can translate that onto other things. And what does it mean for something to be able to be computed? I believe if something can be computed, it's called Turing complete. there are other things bound up in that too, but to just keep it simple, it's better to just move right on along. So, there's this idea of another dynamic too, not just biological psychology, or it's also known as behavioral neuroscience, but cognitive neuroscience. Is it the future of psychology in a way? So, cognitive neuroscience, and computational neuroscience generally do consider how brain processes can be abstracted and represented in many contexts. So it can be utilized in a clinical context, in academia, and in terms of research. And of course, AI, as previously mentioned. In a clinical context, you can maybe apply it to better understanding certain areas of cognition that are, kind of still a bit of a mystery. A lot of higher order cognitive functioning still isn't fully understood. Or neuropsychology, maybe how injuries to the brain can affect cognition, and how you can kind of try to investigate these phenomenon in a variety of ways. But generally, these kinds of fields would bridge together concepts in data science, cognitive science, and even philosophy. But there's a lot of philosophical history bound up in psychology and neuroscience and human behavior. So thanks for listening. I tried to condense a lot into something really short. I intend to make more detailed, descriptive, and even animated videos potentially surrounding these kinds of things. I don't really like condensing so much into such a short time, but you know, it's what I'm doing right now, unfortunately. So again, thanks. Your cognitive health matters. I like to emphasize, learn about your health and your brain as often as you can. There's no reason not to. So I always try to have a little closing quote that I think is relevant. So maybe the human brain is an object beyond the reach of metaphor, for the simple reason that it is the only object capable of creating metaphors to describe itself. There really is nothing else like it. The human brain creates the human mind, and then the human mind tries to underhand the human brain, however long it takes and whatever the cost. So I would hope that that is something to ponder, and I'll